feeling of, hey, you're better than everybody else. We're going to get out of this. Now, Hitler began to break the Treaty of Versailles by building up Germany's army. And this way he got people back to work. And in fact, in Germany, the Depression was over with in 1936. And guess what? Time magazine, and folk, I had a student do a paper on this. Time magazine named Adolf Hitler Man of the Year in 1936. This is documented. He was looked on. Now, it's true now, Time magazine did make note of his anti-Semitism. Way back on page 42, something like that, of the magazine, it had one little bitty article about Hitler's anti-Semitism and Hitler's racism. But otherwise, the front page of the same magazine talked about his accomplishments, his achievement. The United States was still in its depression. Britain was still in its depression. France was still in a depression. But Germany was out of it. Now, again, most of the men were put to work building armaments. The story goes that one German young man got married, found out he was about to have a baby, and then he was unemployed, but he was told, hey, you go to work at this baby carriage factory. So, hey, I don't know what I'll do. I'll just go to each department every night and steal the end products of every department. I'll come home and I'll assemble a baby carriage. Security was a little bit lax, so he was able to go to each department each day, steal the end products of that department. Oh, by the way, I must tell you, what they were doing in this factory was assembling the parts for the baby carriage. The actual baby carriage was being assembled hundreds of miles away. Now, I'll tell you this, when I was at Lockheed, this is the way they kept secrets at Lockheed. You would make it certain you wouldn't know what you were building. And the next person would be building something he didn't know. It would be assembled somewhere else by people who did not know what you had built. Composites. I mean, you'd mix a few chemicals and send them on. The next one, and eventually it came out composites. Only a few people really knew the secret. And folks, I can't tell you the secret, but I do know how they kept the secret, if you follow the logic. But basically, this man put together the parts he had stolen from each department, and he had not a baby carriage, but a machine gun.
Machine gun?
Oh, yes. Well, what he was told was going to be a baby carriage. Once he went to the other factory, it was assembled. Well, and actually, when he assembled the parts himself, he had a machine gun. Again, this story was told. I can imagine what would it have been like to be living under those conditions. Just somehow knowing deep down something was terribly, terribly wrong. Where you think, it's all going to turn out all right, it will be okay in the end. Well, it wouldn't. Hitler got together a lot of rallies, mass demonstrations, again, something that had not been possible in previous generations. He insisted that the German people maintain absolute order. In actual reality, again, I've reading the book about these people who went through it, and these people, as they got older, they were told to explain to the younger generation, the kids growing up after the war, Daddy, why did you let this happen? Or Daddy, how did they would try to explain it. Well, we thought someone else would take care of them. We thought someone else would fix the problem. But also, they would try to explain we just simply did not know what to do. Everybody was just being swayed and pulled in by the crowd. And we felt like we could not oppose the crowd, and we found ourselves being swayed also. One thing the Nazis did to help bolster themselves was emphasize athletics. And the communists have said the same thing. If you could get the young people interested in sports instead of politics, or get them preoccupied with sex, we can eventually take over the nation. And Germany was no exception. They began to get preoccupied with who was the fastest runner, who was the best boxer. The champion boxer was Max Schmeling. And they wound up putting Max Schmeling against the American champ named Joe Louis. Joe Louis was a black man. Max Schmeling won the first fight. It was a close fight. Joe Louis came back to win the second fight. And this was a big blow to Nazi pride. I mean, how could a black man whip a white champion? Then Joe Louis won the third fight, which was, by that time it was a convincing round, and the third fight was convincing. In addition, a black runner named Jesse Owen went to the Olympics in 1936 in Munich and outran every one of the white runners who was put up against him. Some of you may have heard the story. All right, speaking of the 1936 Olympics, that was the first year that the Olympic torch was run toward Athens, Greece. Held the Olympic torch. Does anyone, whose idea was it to carry the torch? It's still done. The idea originated with Adolf Hitler. The circles, I'm going to see if I can draw them. 5 circles. That's a symbol of the Olympics. That idea also, Adolf Hitler's. Still a symbol of the Olympics. It originated with him. We still use it. 5, so have you seen it? Maybe I haven't drawn it quite right. The 5 circles in a line, interlaced, interwoven. You've seen it. Yeah, that idea was Adolf Hitler's. Again, he emphasized sports as a means of convincing his people that they were superior. And unfortunately, it somewhat backfired on some American black athletes were able to outdistance, outdefeat, outrun his blonde, superior blonde German athletes. Now, again, Jews kept on being purged. They were taxed into poverty, forced to live in ghettos. Their businesses were all closed down. Von Hindenburg died, and again, the office of president was abolished, and Hitler became the only ruler of Germany. And all the public officials and soldiers were required to take an oath to Hitler. Now, folks, this is something that a Roman general had done way back 2,000 years ago. Now, when I joined the army, I put one hand on the Bible and raised my right hand toward heaven and swore to the United States. But if I had joined the German army in the 1930s, I would have sworn an oath to Adolf Hitler personally, that I would follow him. Never mind Germany, I'm following Hitler. And again, this was something an ancient Roman general had done. Instead of having the troops that joined his army swear an oath of loyalty to the Roman Republic, he had them swear an oath of loyalty to him personally. Again, very dangerous. The SS was Hitler's means of enforcing his rules. Now, folk, the SS were a bunch of stormtroopers in charge of placing Hitler in power and keeping him in power, and making sure that everybody who opposed him were terrorized out of existence and terrorized to silence. You might think the SS would be rewarded. Eventually what happened was when Hitler decided he was through with the SS, he accused them all of murder and a bunch of other crimes, and basically had most of them executed or imprisoned. This is the way that the communists, by the way, have rewarded their people. I mean, just ask Trotsky. I mean, he's been dead for 70 years, but after working so hard for Lenin, Stalin brushed him aside. Just ask Khrushchev. He's been dead for about 40 years, but after working so hard for communism, the communists brushed him aside. We don't need you anymore. You're worthless old trash. That was, in effect, their term. Hitler wound up laying aside the SS, but for a time, they were his stormtroopers. Now, Himmler was placed in charge of the SS, and again, Hitler surrounded himself by men like Göring and Goebbels, almost all of whom committed suicide at the end of the war. The higher-ups, Hitler, Göring, Goebbels, Himmler, all committed suicide. The rest of them tried to escape and some of them successfully escaped. And the place they wound up where most of them wound up going was Latin America. I'm jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Some of them, though, found their way into the United States. And from time to time, still, even as late as 2014, some of these former Nazis might surface. Hitler looked on women, like Mussolini, as being the bearers of children, that they were the ones who were going to bring about the future of the Nazis, and they were going to... Essentially, what Hitler and Mussolini both had in mind was to encourage the women to have lots of babies and increase the population, which they believed would give them an edge in a future war. The idea of birth control and limiting population, that came about after the war, but until this time, it was you women get out of the workplace, go home, have a lot of babies, and these babies will help make our nation the greatest nation on earth.
Hitler wasn't even blonde, was he? Or?
Wasn't even blonde? No, he was not even blonde.
And he didn't have blue eyes either, right? Yeah.
He was neither a blue-eyed man nor blonde.
I mean,
okay, hey, you're catching on, you're observant. This was the sheer inconsistency. I don't know if I should use the word hypocrisy, but the sheer inconsistency of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Again, and the people who have followed him have been just as, and by the way, I mean, I'm going to fast forward to 2014. Anti-Semitism is making a huge comeback in Europe at this time. And it's somewhat difficult to explain why, except I have to say what I was saying. The only explanation I have is the war is against God. But the war is a war against God. I'm not saying whether or not God exists, but it's just whether or not he exists, they're fighting him. It's a war. In fact, all right, this brings me to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the more prominent German theologians. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was just about the only clergyman in Germany who opposed Hitler and wound up being hung for it. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer got a hold of a paper. I mean, his brother-in-law happened to work for someone high up in the Nazis, and he got a hold of a paper and said that Hitler's plan was to get rid of all Jews first, and then get rid of Christians. But he couldn't get rid of Christians first because there were too many of them. He said once the Jews got gone, he was going to either force the Christians into abandoning Christianity or kill them, just like he had done the Jews. So he had plans to eradicate both. But against the Jews, he was able to kill millions. Against the Christians, he was never able to quite pull it off because he found himself involved in a war that he could not win. All right. Again, the Nazis tried to drive women out of the labor market, or at least much of the labor market. Any job like heavy industry, because they knew that if a woman worked too hard, she might have difficulty bearing healthy children. And teaching, medicine, and law were not appropriate for women under Nazi, and especially married women. So they said instead, they told women to pursue occupations like social work and nursing. These jobs would not strain a woman's body to where supposedly she'd still be free to have healthy children.